is this has much less to do with Mamdani himself and much less to do with Mamdani's policies and everything to do with Cuomo misreading the room when he kept asserting his loyalty to Zionists or his loyalty to the Israelis. And it's important to highlight that the Zionists made this about Israel. The Zionists tried to push in New York that this was about how do you make Jews feel safe? What would you do if Israel's Netanyahu came to New York City? Will you visit Israel and make the pilgrimage to show respect for the Israelis? And New Yorkers increasingly began to ask, I'm trying to understand here. I'm struggling here in New York. I'm struggling with domestic issues.
There has been a really political seismic shift. Zohran Mamdani, against all the odds, has managed to win the Democratic nomination for the New York mayoral elections. And with me, to make sense of all of this, we have none other than Sami Hamdi, a man who needs no introduction, who is the political commentator for us as a Muslim community in the West. Sami, welcome. I'm really excited to have you on as ever.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, Sami, please just explain to us how on earth has this happened and how important is this in the wider context?
I think there are a number of things to consider first and foremost. I think the first is that since the defeat of Harris at the US presidential election, the idea of Zionism being a political asset or a political liability has been an issue that has begun to be debated within the US itself. The idea being, to what extent is Zionism central to a candidate's ability to win elections? According to YouGov, 29% of those who did not vote in the elections, so 29% of 15 million people who did not vote in the elections, the reason they did not vote is because they did not want to choose a genocider in Harris, as they said, or a fascist in Donald Trump. Genocide being linked to the idea of what Zionism or the Israelis are doing in Palestine itself. Subsequently, we saw under the Trump administration, there's been a growing spotlight on the allegiances that politicians have towards the idea of Zionism. We saw a bill try to be pushed through Congress that would punish any US citizen who would boycott Israel with either a fine of $1 million or even jail time. We saw that bill being pulled as people started to discuss why is it that Congress was voting on a bill for an interest of a foreign state as opposed to the interest of an American state. We saw with the arrest of Mahmoud Khalil and the attempted deportation of Mahmoud Khalil that even right-wingers like Ann Coulter and these others were beginning to ask questions. Why are the freedom of speech rights being hindered or restricted for the interest of a foreign nation? And what we saw in the New York mayoral primary race is that Cuomo initially, who is the former mayor and former governor of New York, he was initially the favorite and ahead of Mamdani in the polls. Mamdani initially was nowhere really near him in the polls and gradually began to catch up. But I think this is a story less about Mamdani catching up and more about Cuomo increasingly being unable to adapt to a changing electorate. And here's what I mean. The polls show that Zionism amongst the Democrat Party no longer enjoys the support it once had. Only 21% of Democrats support the Israelis today. Support for Israel has crashed. But Cuomo appeared not to get the memo or to get the script. And it appeared that every time that Cuomo would talk about Israel or would talk about his allegiance to Israel, he would start to decline in the polls and Mamdani would increase. And then Cuomo would double down on his support for Zionism, and the next poll would show that Cuomo's polls would decrease and Mamdani would increase. And then the debates would take place in which you would get the news presenters challenging Mamdani on his position of Israel, and they would ask candidates where would be the first place you would visit, and they would all say Israel except Mamdani. But as a result of saying Israel, Cuomo's rating again dropped even further, and Mamdani suddenly found himself starting to go ahead of Cuomo. The point I'm making is this has much less to do with Mamdani himself and much less to do with Mamdani's policies and everything to do with Cuomo misreading the room when he kept asserting his loyalty to Zionists or his loyalty to the Israelis. And it's important to highlight that the Zionists made this about Israel. The Zionists tried to push in New York that this was about how do you make Jews feel safe? What would you do if Israel's Netanyahu came to New York City? Will you visit Israel and make the pilgrimage to show respect for the Israelis? And New Yorkers increasingly began to ask, I'm trying to understand here. I'm struggling here in New York. I'm struggling with domestic issues. But every time I open the channel to hear what the candidates are talking about, Stephen Colbert is asking people about Israel. You have CNN asking people about Israel. Everybody asks people about Israel. And so it was not about Mamdani, to his credit, did not say anything similar to Cuomo in terms of asserting the right of Zionism. And this is why I argue that this was more of a rebellion and vote against Zionism than it was a vote for Mamdani. This was less a support of Mamdani himself as this sort of new candidate on the scene, and more a rejection of the traditional politics whereby Zionism would take supremacy over New York interests. And this is why I think we saw the gradual changing of the polls, where Cuomo was way ahead of Mamdani, and I think Cuomo is the one who threw it away. And what it appears now is, I think that Cuomo has announced now that, not I think, but Cuomo has announced that he's running as an independent. And we now have Zionists like Bill Ackman coming out and saying that on top of the 25 million that Cuomo had to try to beat Mamdani in the first place, that was given to him predominantly by Zionists in order to ensure that Cuomo could beat Mamdani, Ackman is now coming out and saying, I'm willing to give money and fund any candidate who stands the best chance of toppling Mamdani. The reason being is, for Bill Ackman, this is not about Mamdani himself, but about New Yorkers coming out and rejecting Zionism and a scramble to preserve Zionism as a political asset rather than have Mamdani prove that it's a political liability.
And what does this mean, Sami, for US politics as a whole? Like, is it for a start, is it guaranteed that he is going to win the mayoral election? Because everyone is saying that, look, if you win the Democratic nomination, you've basically won the mayoral election. Do you think that this time could be different because of all of this machinations that are happening in the background? And let's kind of project out both narratives, right? One is where he somehow manages to lose the election, or where he, as predicted, he ends up winning the election. Either way, if we kind of run both of those approaches, what does that mean for US politics for the next 5 years?
I think that first and foremost, what is worth noting is that Mamdani's victory in the primary race for the candidacy in the mayoral election was interpreted by mainstream, not mainstream Americans, was interpreted by many Americans, such as Tucker Carlson, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and these others, who actually did a podcast together in which they not congratulated, but rather they praised Mamdani for rejecting to focus on issues outside of New York and insisting on focusing on issues in New York. Tucker Carlson, in highlighting why Mamdani might have won, told Marjorie Taylor Greene, who agreed with him, the Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, that Mamdani's focus on New York while everybody else was focused on Israel and Zionism is the reason probably Mamdani won. And Marjorie Taylor Greene suggested that she approved of Mamdani focusing on American issues first and not focusing on Zionism or on Israel. That's significant. Why? Because Mamdani's challenge is not from Cuomo himself as an independent candidate, but from the Democrat Party leadership that is concerned that if Mamdani wins, then Democrat leadership will be overthrown in other states as well, given now there is a clear disconnect between the Democrat leadership of Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi and between the base where less than 21% of Democrats now view Israel favorably. The reality is that now this is a battle for the future of the Democrat Party. Does it belong to the base or does it belong to a Zionist leadership? Does it belong to the base or does it belong to a leadership that values Zionism over the views of a base that are far more pro-Palestinian, that are far more anti-Zionist, and that are far more pro-ceasefire, and that are far more willing to discuss or prefer to discuss issues about America itself rather than prioritizing Israeli issues and Tel Aviv issues over that of New York or indeed any other particular state. And I think this is why Mamdani may have won the primary race, but it remains to be seen whether Cuomo underestimated Mamdani and therefore they won't make the same mistake again, or whether Mamdani will be able to galvanize that momentum, that anti-Zionist momentum, in order to deliver that blow in the primary election. The second thing in the mayoral election, the second thing worth noting here is this, that the voter turnout for these elections is often quite low, indicating many people aren't particularly interested. So the question is, what does this result do to those who sat on the fence? Do they rush to go and vote for Mamdani, or do they rush to go in and save Zionism? In my view, I think that Zionists always engage, they always participate, they don't take risks, meaning the maximum Zionist turnout is the one we saw that came out for Cuomo. What was interesting about Mamdani's voting bloc is that 25% of those who voted are reportedly first-time voters, and they overwhelmingly voted for Mamdani, indicating the new American generation, the new New Yorkers, are not swayed by this idea that they need to support Zionism. And this is significant because this is what the head of the ADL, the Zionist lobby, said would happen last year in a leaked recording. He said that because we're losing the battle on social media, because Zionists, he's talking as a Zionist, because we Zionists are losing the battle on social media, he said, quote, we have lost an entire American generation. And he warned that this generation, when he was presented to the Knesset, that it would affect the long-term relationship between Israel and the US. Here we see the first glimpse of how the new generation votes. Here we see the first glimpse of how this lost generation, the generation that Zionists lost, decide to vote. And they're voting overwhelmingly for Mamdani, not necessarily, again, because of Mamdani or who he represents or the identity politics or the like. I don't think it has anything to do with that. I think that even those who are saying that it's the Muslim vote or the like, I think that Muslims are more voting for Mamdani against Zionism as opposed to voting for Mamdani himself. The reason why I highlight this is what the New York mayoral race is going to make clear is how much of a liability has Zionism become. How much money will it take to rescue Zionism if Cuomo wins? And how much money would be spent on the race and Cuomo still lose because Zionism, no amount of money will be able to let Zionism win again, because as long as Mamdani is anti-Zionism, therefore Mamdani is the candidate who goes over Cuomo. This is the main battleground at this moment in time that will test the limits of how far Zionism has fallen in terms of it being seen as a political asset. And the final dynamic worth noting here is this. Traditionally, if you make a surprise in the first round, you lose in the second round because Zionism tends to rally. The reason I pointed out Tucker Carlson and Marjorie Taylor Greene and these others is because Mamdani is being attacked on the right for being a socialist. And Donald Trump, of course, did that post where he's coming after Mamdani, and they're using Islamophobic tropes that he wants to make New York, you know, Sharia compliant and all these other things as well. I said Sharia compliant because that's a phrase you guys use quite often. But in any case, that they want to make New York Sharia and the like. What's interesting is that Tucker Carlson and Marjorie Taylor Greene demonstrate a crack within that right-wing debate, whereby Zionism has frustrated them so much that they're almost breathing a sigh of relief that an American first politician can be seen in Zohran Mamdani, who deserves praise for insisting on America first. And that's a strange bridge when you think about a right-winger and Zohran Mamdani suddenly find. And what brought them together? Anti-Zionism. What brought them together is the realization and the subsequent rejection of Zionism taking priority over American interest. And this is a new dynamic. This is a unique dynamic that may well work in Mamdani's favor, and where Zionism has been able to rally before, they may not be able to rally this time.
And Sami, what do you think is the future for people like AIPAC, right? And the thing that really intrigued me in all of this was that after Tel Aviv, I was doing some Googling, after Tel Aviv, this New York is the most populous Jewish city, right? 10% of the population is apparently Jewish. And so that would indicate to me, even the runner, the guy second with Zohran Mamdani, he's Jewish himself, right? He's a liberal Jew. And what does that say about Jews in America and their relationship with Israel?
I think that there is something very interesting happening amongst the Jewish population in America, whereby many Jews, and it's not just younger Jews, many Jews have been turned off Zionism as a result of the genocide that they've seen unfold. And I think that this trend has been very gradual, but it's been accelerating since the genocide that's been perpetrated by the Israelis on the Palestinians. I remember being in Chicago and I shared the stage with one of the heads of the Jewish Voice for Peace. And I remember during his speech, he said, when I was growing up, I was Zionist. And then I became two-state solutionist. And now I am anti-Zionist. I believe that the Israeli state, that justice means that the Israeli state no longer exists, that it's a one-state solution for all, where everybody lives side by side. I think what the genocide did was it accelerated this process that happened with this leader of the Jewish Voice for Peace that I spoke about, whereby young Jews are saying that we're killing babies, we're slaughtering kids, we're massacring women, we're killing innocent people, and the Israelis are saying that they're doing it in the name of Judaism and Jews, not in my name. My name is that New York looks different, that it's for all, that we stand for humanity, we stand against this injustice. And that's as a result of the images that they are seeing on social media and the like, whether it's TikTok, Instagram, and the like. And I think it shows this trend where even on social media, you find very prominent Jewish TikTokers and Jewish social media accounts doing parody videos in which they elaborate on why they are supporting Mamdani over the Zionist candidate, why they as a Jew feel closer to Mamdani than they do feel towards Cuomo and the Zionists, why they believe that when people are saying, will Jews be safe, they say, I feel safer under Mamdani, who presents a vision that we can all be together, than Andrew Cuomo and the Zionists, who insist that they need to continue genocide in order to protect them, when they believe that it's the genocide that's making them unsafe in the first place by turning public opinion against them. I think what is phenomenal about Mamdani's victory, and this again goes back to this point about it being less about Mamdani himself, is this idea that the overwhelming aversion to Zionism, including amongst Jews who make up such a significant population of New York, is such that Jews themselves are not inclined to go and rescue Zionism in order to protect themselves or make themselves feel safe. They feel safer condemning Zionism and saying to the Americans that we also believe in preserving the social and immediate interest of our community first, not Zionism that is parasitically draining resources in America and committing a horrific genocide in the process.
And Sami, I mean, I didn't realize that they've decided to get behind Cuomo again. He seems like almost like a parody of a character, you know, that you would want to put forward after having lost once. I mean, this guy is very credibly been accused of all sorts of, you know, sexual assaults and all sorts of things. And you know, and on the other side, there's the other guy, I can't remember his name now, who's been accused of, and he was actually, you know, yeah, exactly. He was in court. He was facing charges until he got pardoned by Donald Trump. I mean, if these are the almost like parody, you know, characters that the billionaire classes have put forward, like, you know, that doesn't speak very highly of their tactical nous, I feel.
But the thing is, if you put it like that, yes, but think about it from a different angle. Everybody is saying that Cuomo lost because he supported Zionism. They're not saying Zohran won because of his policies. They're saying Cuomo lost because of Zionism. And therefore, the Zionists are concerned that if this is the acknowledged analysis of what happened to Cuomo, then that will start a domino effect in the rest of the country that will see a collapse of the entire lobby and influence, because Cuomo lost in a place where there is the largest concentration of Jews and where Zionists traditionally have believed that this is their domain and this is their base. What the Zionists, the reason they're supporting Cuomo is precisely because he lost. They want to prove to you and prove to the global public opinion that Mamdani won as a fluke in the first round, and that New York has rallied to defeat him in the second round because they realize that Zionism and Cuomo is what is relevant to them. It is precisely because Cuomo lost that they believe they have to support Cuomo, because if they do not support him, then the narrative stays. Cuomo lost because of Zionism, so we brought a new candidate who stood on a different platform, so no one should stand on Zionism. The Zionists believe this is a potential existential threat. Cuomo has to win by any means necessary. Cuomo has to win and prove he did not lose because of Zionism. Cuomo has to win so that Americans don't say that Zionism is a political liability. Cuomo has to win so that people can say that Mamdani initially might have had a good campaign in the first round, but could not show statesmanship in the second round because statesmanship looks Zionist, it looks Cuomo-esque. That's why they're supporting God. It makes every sense to support Cuomo, and I think that what the Zionists are doing is they're raising the stakes. If the stakes were limited in the first round of this poker game, the Zionists are saying, okay, I lost the first round, let me go all in. And they're challenging the New Yorkers and Mamdani to go all in as well. And this is why it's quite fascinating for me to hear you pose the question that there could be two scenarios, almost as if there is a cautious optimism on your part, or indeed on the part of those who are watching Mamdani, in that Zionism may be cracked, but no one truly believes that it's collapsing yet. It's almost as if, do you hold with a bated breath whether Mamdani will win, or have we been here before where this is like an initial punch and the Zionists come back with a killer blow later on? And that's what the Zionists also believe, that this is a temporary setback. So long as Cuomo wins, we can erase that previous defeat. And what people will say is, they will say, yes, in the first round, Cuomo might have lost because of Zionism, but he won on the second round because the Zionists campaigned better and convinced the New Yorkers of the legitimacy of Zionism. And that's why for the Zionists, New York is the test that will either make or break Zionism as a political liability or a political asset.
What does this mean for Muslims, both in America, but then also further afield? What does this mean for UK politics as well? Because, let me kind of, I guess, articulate what I'm thinking. I think a lot of the time over the last over the last decade or so, Muslim politicians, like, example might be Sadiq Khan in London, and other many Muslim politicians, they very much end up towing the line, right? They end up falling into the kind of mainstream narrative, slightly left of center mainstream narratives. But here, Mamdani, the slightly different thing about him was, I think he didn't apologize. He didn't necessarily back down from some of his like core views that he held. And I wonder if even Muslim candidates, even wider candidates, do you think that there's a pocket of space that has now been created where you're now increasingly going to see campaigns that are much more authentic, I guess, and we'll just say it as it is. And if there have been anti-Zionist historically, are consistently anti-Zionist, both in the US but also in the West generally.
I think that I would be wary of how much we press the identity politics with Mamdani, primarily because I think that the way Mamdani presents himself suggests he will be like Sadiq Khan in the way that we have in the UK today, whereby he comes to power and the values and the likes that he espouses ends up alienating more than it brings Muslims into his crowd. I'm very wary of pushing the idea that this is a victory for Mamdani because of himself and his politics, as opposed to the reality, which is that it's an anti-Zionist vote. And I think anybody who said some of the stuff Mamdani did, as long as they were up against the Zionists, they were more likely to win anyway. And this is what I mean, in that when you look at Mamdani's campaign, his campaign has evolved. Mamdani early on in the campaign said Israel has the right to exist, and he found a backlash from his own base. Mamdani later realized that when Cuomo would talk about supporting Zionism, he'd drop in the polls, and that galvanized him to show the confidence to be able to say, I don't need to toe that line. I don't need to say it anymore. It's clear from the polls. I don't need to be scared anymore. I don't need to be so fearful that I need to affirm some sort of support for Zionism, because all the data seems to show that every time Cuomo says Israel, he drops in the polls. And we saw Mamdani gradually become bolder in the way that he would present his narratives. And he went from saying Israel has the right to exist, and that's why I will say to Jews who feel unsafe, to Israel has the right to exist, but not as a Jewish state. And then expanding on it, Israel has the right to exist, but as a one-state solution with the Palestinians. And he would adapt and grow as his confidence grew, as he became more assured that Zionism was becoming a political liability. That's very important to note in terms of development, because what it shows for the UK here is that it shows that for politicians, we may not need to bandy to the Zionism track in a way that many have done so in the past. And indeed, you're well aware that in the last council elections, when Labour thought after the general election that people would forget about Gaza after a year, they were sending out listening parties to the community just to listen, and the hope that the Muslims and their allies and the people of humanity who are non-Muslims who went to protest and the like, that they would get tired and fatigued after protesting for 1 year, and Labour would recoup the losses that it took in the general election that saw more than 40 seats go from safe seats to marginal seats. What surprised Labour is that in the council elections, they ended up losing not only seats to Reform, they also lost to other independent candidates who ran on the punish genocide vote, indicating that Zionism was still a political liability 1 year on from the general election, showing that the community had not forgotten about it. We have the signs even in the UK ourselves, before Mamdani came along, that Zionism was becoming a political liability. I think what Mamdani shows is Mamdani is the greatest manifestation of what happens if you're brave enough to not take the Zionist line, and when you finally ride the wave of popular momentum to actually challenge the Zionism. Something that I think perhaps even some of our independent MPs could be more bolder, because one of the issues that we have in the UK is, okay, we have those 4 independent MPs who got elected on the back of the punish genocide vote, but they're not making anywhere near the splash that people thought they would make. They're barely visible in mainstream debate, barely visible. And the risk that actually poses now is that 3 years down the line, when we go to general elections, when you present the punish genocide vote, they will point to these independent MPs and say, with the greatest of respect, they went to parliament and did absolutely nothing. What Mamdani is demonstrating is, and this is why I'm phrased as an anti-Zionist vote, is that irrespective of what he does when he's in power, irrespective of what he does when he's in power, it will be unanimously recognized that he won because the other side was too Zionist. That is the game changer here. The game changer is not Mamdani. The game changer is not what Mamdani might bring or what he might not bring about. We have the very sad example of AOC, who started off as the squad, as the challenger, and ended up becoming pretty much almost part of the establishment. She still tries to maintain some sort of separation, but even during the genocide, she came out and said Harris is working tirelessly for it, and it would later be leaked that she was doing nothing for it. In other words, AOC, in flirting with the idea of a presidency, ended up losing a lot of what made her so popular in those circles that believe she would be revolutionary. Mamdani may end up like that. Mamdani may end up like Sadiq Khan. But that is not the point of what is happening here. Even if Mamdani were to become like Sadiq Khan, the reason for him getting to power and the consequences of him coming to power on the wider political landscape and dynamics of politics would be irreversible. If Mamdani wins, it will be because Zionism has become a political liability that must be avoided at all costs. Otherwise, another Mamdani will win. It will break the back of Zionists in the sense that it will be one of the first times where it's not that Mamdani wins, but the incumbent, or rather the main candidate, popular candidate, the establishment candidate loses specifically because they supported Zionism, with the question mark being, if they hadn't supported Zionism, could they have beaten Mamdani? That will always be the question over here. That's what I think the Mamdani phenomenon promises to bring out, which is why I'm less focused. And it's not that I'm pessimistic. I'm less focused on what Mamdani will do when he gets to power, and more focused on what the Zionists are terrified of. They're terrified not only of Mamdani winning, they're terrified that Harris lost because of Gaza, meaning a presidential election lost because of Gaza, and a lot of money went into propaganda to try to frame it otherwise, and polls would later prove that Harris lost by 3-point-something million votes to Donald Trump, and more than 3-point-something million votes didn't vote in the election because they were angry with Harris over Gaza. The polls demonstrated Gaza swung that US elections. The Zionists fear that they may have been able to raise doubt over the presidential election, but if Mamdani wins, no amount of money will be able to plaster over the fact that Mamdani won because the other side was too Zionist.
Sami, I wanted to talk a little bit about, what does Mamdani actually stand for? And some of his general policies, some of his economic policies, and I guess have a bit of a discussion between us around what does it mean for us as Muslims living in the West? And I'm not saying, I don't think Mamdani in any way is a Muslim candidate, right? I think he just happens to be Muslim, but he is, his own man, and he's doing his own thing. But just using this as a good moment to kind of think about, what does Islam and Muslims, from a policy making perspective, what do we have to, offer the West, the countries that we live in, as genuine solutions for some of the big problems that we've got, right? We've got economic crises on one hand, we've got inequalities, and we've got, class divides, and then we've got the rise of the far right going on. We've got, crumbling, public infrastructure, and this is a consistent trend across all of the West. Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts around how we as Muslims authentically, come across and present ideas to the communities we live in.
I think that one of the things that is worth noting is that what I noticed about American Muslims when I went to the US is American Muslims don't have the debate that many British Muslims have, which is, do we belong to this land or do we not? American Muslims believe themselves entirely that they are Muslims that belong in America. They are American Muslims and therefore owe a duty to the society and land in which they live in. And that has manifested in the way that Mamdani says with the greatest of convictions that he wants to fix New York. He wants to make it easier for people to get on buses. He wants to make rent prices easier. He wants to make the city affordable for no other reason than he cares about his society. He cares about his people. He cares about that which is around him. And he wants to be, for want of a better phrase, he wants to be a mercy to his society in the way that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was a mercy to mankind. Here I'm not talking about the values per se, I'm talking about the attitude towards society itself. And I think this is an Islamic attitude, the idea that wherever we are, how can we deal with the loneliness in our society, with the housing crisis in our society, with the affordability of goods within our society itself? Everybody's putting their prices up. Why does the Muslim need to put their prices up? When we can see people are struggling to living from paycheck to paycheck. I was watching before this interview, actually, randomly. I was laying down on the sofa. I just flew in from Johannesburg to Sarajevo, and I was just pensive, just put something in the TV in the background. And one of the YouTube videos playing was how Islam spread to Indonesia, because it wasn't sent by an army. It was done because when Muslim traders turned up from all different ethnicities, what they did was they made commerce easy. They made getting goods easy. They made it affordable. They contributed to the society in such a way that local rulers would say, you are the most useful in society. I want to be Muslim too. I think sometimes as Muslims, it's important to remember the duty that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has imposed on us as ambassadors of Islam wherever we are, not in Muslim lands per se, wherever we are. We have the ability to provide affordable rents for those who are struggling to find homes. We have the ability to provide affordable goods for those who can't afford to go buy in Asda, or can't afford to go buy in Tesco, or for those who can't afford to buy their daily shopping. When we talk about poverty in the UK, we must not talk about it like it's an abstract concept that's alien to us. It should be something that we should revel in the opportunity to go out to society and say, I am Muslim, Allah has commanded me to look after the poor. Here's my suggestion and proposal for you. We have a zakat system, I can build one for you too. We have a sadaqah system, we can build one for you too. I run Curate Capital with halal investments and the like guaranteed, and here's a model that applies for you too. It's important for people to see that mobilization. I think what Mamdani did so emphatically is, Mamdani's slogan of just a city that we can afford was very powerful in the way it resonated, because what it demonstrated, and this is to address the point about what can Muslims learn from it, is that sometimes Muslims believe we need to compromise our values on the LGBT, on transgender, on these issues in order to make ourselves resonate with the people. What Mamdani demonstrated is that it's the slogan about fixing the economy and people's real issues that resonated the most. Many people and commentators are not mentioning anything about Mamdani's so-called progressive values. That's not what became relevant. What became relevant was one guy's talking about Zionism, one person is talking about making New York more affordable. It's an economic thing. And this is why I would love to see Muslims gamble on our values, gamble on Muslim values, gamble that instead of making the concession that in the religion in order to seek the favor of people, why don't we go and address what people are really worried about, which is those economic issues, in a manner which means that we don't need to make those concessions. And one thing that is worth noting here is this. The British population itself, every research suggests that parties that focus on woke issues tend to lose. Parties that focus on the economy tend to win. Those who have a plan for woke issues tend to lose. Those who have a plan for the economy tend to win. Yet the mantra of Muslim politics is that we need to pander here in order to even have a chance over here. What Mamdani shows is Zionism is not only a political liability, but talking about people's real issues actually work. I was with Sheikh Suhail Hanif, beloved friend of mine, and I'm sure you've met him too, and these others. Suhail Hanif made a good point. He said, we need to make our da'wah relevant to our communities. That's what the Sahaba did so well. What they did was they didn't present Islam as an alien religion. They presented it as the solution to every problem in society. I remember once sitting in the car, I don't know if he's giving me permission to say this, but I'm sure he'll forgive me for it. He was saying, for example, on Christmas, Muslims tend to retreat and run and say, this is shirk, this has nothing to do with us. But why doesn't a Muslim take advantage to say that we also love Jesus too, and here's the real story of Jesus, of what happened? Why do we see it as something to run away from, as opposed to something to take an opportunity? And I'm not saying celebrate Christmas. I'm saying when everybody is talking about Jesus, let's get involved in the debate on Jesus. Why not set things outside the mosque and say, we love Jesus too? And let people come and say, I don't get it. You're Ibrahim wearing a beard like this, and you've got a banner that says, we love Jesus too. And you'll be like, we do love Jesus. I love Jesus because of the way Allah gave him the miracle of how he walked on water, how Allah gave him the miracle of curing the leper. Wait, we have these stories too. And I love Jesus too because of the way that he got his disciples when they asked for food. He asked God for a prayer and the food came down on the table. And I hate the way that Judas betrayed him. And it's good that Allah punished Judas by putting him on the cross and not Jesus. My point is, the attitude of Sheikh Suhail, what struck me about it when we were driving back from Bradford was, Sheikh Suhail is talking about it from an angle of, these are the people that Allah sent us to, let us convey that da'wah to them too, in a way that makes Islam relevant to them too, in the way that Sahaba made Islam relevant to our ancestors too, who were able then to pass it down to us too, so we could become Muslims and hope to spread the message to those who are there in society as well. What I think Mamdani demonstrates is that the obstacles are not as great as we think they are. That even Marjorie Taylor Greene can respect somebody she would otherwise despise because he focused, in her words, on New York. He focused on our people, and I respect him for it. Tucker Carlson wouldn't normally align with Mamdani, but I respect that he's somebody who has come to, who's in America, who is talking about how to make Americans better, American citizens better. It's almost as if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is showing us a lesson in which gamble on the da'wah, gamble that in providing solutions to society, they may not immediately turn you away. And that's why I would love to see more Muslim politicians actually participate and engage in a way in which they say to their communities that, yes, I'm Muslim, but I'm not foreign. Yes, I'm Muslim and I know you're hungry. Yes, I'm Muslim, I know you're lonely. Yes, I'm Muslim, I know you're struggling, and I'm here to fix it, and here's how I'm going to fix it. And I think if we try this in a concentrated way, I think the British public would turn away from Farage and actually turn towards us.
No, Jazakallah khair, Sami. I think it's we need to get you on and continue this conversation. I think there's a really interesting thread here about, basically just doing the right thing, right? Actually solving the problems of the people. And I think there is actually a pocket of space, even ideologically, for authentically faith-based politicians, right? Where you just say, look, when Tony Blair, when he said we don't do God, we actually turn around and say we do God, and that's not going to harm you. In fact, it's going to benefit you, and it's what keeps me on the straight path, and it makes me want to solve these kind of problems. And I think you're right. We need the politicians of the next few years to be brave and really authentically make that case. A bit like Nigel Farage was brave, let's say 15 years ago, right? Where it wasn't popular to be a Eurosceptic, but he kept at it, and then the narrative shifted. Whereas now, even the mainstream people are actually shifting in his direction.
But also, Ibrahim, just on this point, I don't mean to take up your time, but I want to make this point. When everybody remembers the Trojan horse affair, we tend to focus a lot on what happened after the Trojan horse letter, in which the letter accused, the teachers of some Islamic conspiracy plot. Michael Gove took advantage and they came in and they smashed a lot of the schools that they set up. And I understand it's a painful process. A lot of injustice was done and the like. But what I think is also important to focus on is that when Muslims engage in education for the betterment, taking underdeveloped schools that were failing and made them great, Ofsted, non-Muslim organization, was celebrating them. Local councils were celebrating them. Ordinary citizens in the community were celebrating them. My point is that it's not a new concept that people would celebrate very good initiatives and the like. There is a homeless man who used to stand outside of Tesco. I know it's an anecdote, and anecdotes are bad form, but it's worth doing. One day we're walking past him and my daughter sees him and says, Baba, give him money. I said to her, Hanan, I don't have any cash on me. And she got angry. She said, cash machine is over there. Go and walk and get some cash out. I said, fine. She's 10 out. I didn't want to make a bad impression. When I gave her the money to go and give to the homeless man, he said something I will never forget. He walked up and I thought he might be asking for more. He walks up and he goes, excuse me, mate, I said, yeah. Can I just say that, you know, I've been here for a while, and the people who give me money the most are the people who look like you. You know, it's not people who look like me. He's a white guy. It's the people who look like, and I just want to ask a question, why? Wallah, like that. He said, why? Of course, my daughter replied and said, because we're Muslim. Like immediately, before I could even open my mouth. But my point is, people notice, they see it. And this is why I often think that, even on this point, the reason I wanted to finish on this point is I wanted to twist it slightly. We tend to debate the merits of embarking on these initiatives on whether society will recognize us for it, on whether society will say these Muslims are good because they're helping us in our education field, they're improving our poverty and the housing or the like. But Ibrahim, what if I was to suggest to you here that maybe even if they weren't going to do that, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala imposed an obligation on us to do it anyway? That even if society was not going to say to you, thank you, Ibrahim, for the way that you've made housing affordable by buying up land, building houses and selling it at a cheaper price. The way, for example, those in Dallas, Texas, they bought a piece of random land, they built some houses, they ended up selling them, and that model is being replicated elsewhere. Or where South Africans are trying to buy land, they're trying to build cheaper houses to get those in the townships to move into those lands as well. Even if society was to say nothing, and this is the point why I think belief in Allah is easy, but submission to Allah is hard. In that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you can say Allah is the Lord Almighty, but to submit to what He's asked of you, to better the society around you in His name and in the name of Islam, that's hard. Why is it hard? Because it requires you to do so on the basis that Allah's acceptance is enough for you. That if no one appreciated you except Allah, that would be enough for you. And that, I think, more than Islamophobia, more than any issue in society, is the crux of why we have some of the issues that we have in the Muslim community. It's not to do with our capabilities. We know we can make a change. The reason I mentioned the Trojan horse affair is the Birmingham lot, they made a difference in the schools. The issue is not whether we can make a difference or not. The issue is whether, if the people never say thank you for it, is Allah's willingness to forgive us and accept our deeds, is Allah sufficient? And I don't know. Muslims might say yes, but I don't know if their actions show that that answer is an emphatic yes.
Brilliant. No, Jazakallah khair, Sami. I think it's a very, very powerful point to end on. This has been very illuminating. I think it's clarified a lot of things personally for me in my head when it comes to understanding Mamdani and the shifts that we've seen in politics, both in the US but also across the West over the last few months. And inshallah, this will be I think the second or third time you've been on, but certainly not the last.
My honor. I'm glad you keep inviting me, alhamdulillah.
Jazakallah khair. I'll let you crack on with Bosnia, and inshallah we'll speak again.
Inshallah. Take care, Habib. Barakallahu feek.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.